Hello everyone and welcome to today's Cambridge University Press ELT webinar. I'm Jenny Mutley-Collins and I'll be moderating today's session along with my colleagues Becky East, Ellie Benstead and Stuart Vinney, who you might see in the questions. During the webinar you'll be able to hear our speaker Deb Hobbs and you'll be able to see her slides, but you won't be able to see Deb herself. You won't need a microphone. If you want to ask a question, please use the questions tab, which you should be able to see in your control panel on the right of your screen. So that's the questions tab. The recording of today's webinar will be on our blog and on YouTube next week. We'll email you a copy of your attendance certificate the week after the webinar, and you'll also be able to download a copy at the end. And it's lovely to see so many of you joining from different parts of the world. I can see lots of hellos from Uzbekistan, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, Brazil, Argentina, Lebanon. I mean, the list is going on and on and on. There's so many of you on here today. So we will try to answer as many of your questions as we can as we go through the webinar. However, if you've got an important question for Deb, please wait until the end. We'll have a special question and answer session. So unless we're kind of asking you, we may miss what you're saying. We'll try and pick it up, but you might need to repeat that at the end just because there's so many of you and the questions are moving very quickly. Okay, so I'm very pleased to welcome Deb Hobbs as this afternoon's presenter. Deb works in Bristol at the moment as a freelance author and instructional designer, and also as an English language lecturer and teacher in adult and higher education. She's enjoyed over 10 years of English language teaching, examining and training, and she regularly speaks at international teacher training events. She has worked in several countries, including China, Italy and Spain. Deborah holds a DIP TESOL and is currently studying for an MA ODE Open. That's a technology enhanced learning and design. Prior to becoming an educator, Deborah was a business change and project manager in financial services. So after that introduction, over to you, Deb, for the webinar.
Thank you, Jenny. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for that lovely introduction, Jenny. So let's kick off. So today I will be talking about collaboration and what it means to me. We'll be looking at collaboration in the general English classroom versus the exam in English classroom. I'll be talking about some barriers to collaboration, and here we'll be thinking about face-to-face barriers and online barriers. I'm sure you've all experienced online teaching recently. And then we'll be thinking about removing those barriers and opening up the divide between the general English classroom and the exam English classroom, whether that be face-to-face or in an online environment. So in the question and answers box, you could now please put down or type what you think collaboration means for you. Here is my mind map of what collaboration means for me. And arguably collaboration, there are any activities where the learners are working cooperatively in pairs or in groups. But you can see here that I'm thinking about partnerships, cooperation, teamwork. All of those, I think, rely quite heavily on trust. Trust between the learners, but also trust between the learners and ourselves as educators. I'm thinking about participation and how students can participate in a flexible and mobile way. And when I'm thinking about mobile learning, I'm really thinking about mobility in terms of being on the move. For example, I taught some Chinese students recently at an online pre-sessional course, one of whom regularly did her homework tasks on the bus on her way home from university. We're thinking also about sharing and openness, how learning, teacher to student, student to student, leads on to success, motivation, and the connection there with student-generated materials. If you look at the bottom left here, synchronous versus asynchronous collaboration. Here we're thinking about synchronous, so at the same time, maybe the students are in the classroom, or as we are now meeting together at the same time, or in an asynchronous environment where perhaps the students are working at different times, maybe because they live in different countries with different time zones. And we really need to think about how the students are able to collaborate if they are working at different times. Jenny, I wonder if you have anything else in the question and answers box from our educators that you could add?
Sorry, just had to unmute myself. Yeah, if anybody's got any suggestions or feedback on what Deb has just presented, do put it in the question box so that we can have a look. I can see engagement from Sarah Amer. Still lots of hellos, so people still joining the webinar. That's great. Let's just see any other feedback for Deb at this point. Blended.
Yes, that's quite important, isn't it?
Collaboration is a two-way process. Mozilla Orozco. Success. Okay, still lots of you joining. Hello, hello. Welcome if you're just joining the webinar now.
Okay, so thank you, Jenny. I quite
Feedback,
like
sharing ideas, flipped classroom. Okay, we've got a few coming through now.
Wonderful, that's great.
Collaboration, mutual interests, learning, friendship. Oh, yeah, lots of ideas there from participants. Collaboration is all about the learning process. Blended online, integration, cooperative learning. Engagement and motivation, receiving feedback and generating responses to that. Yeah. Okay, yeah, lots of ideas there.
Lovely. Thank you, Jenny. I'll take that over again now.
Okay.
But yeah, I like the comments there around blended learning. I think that's quite important, isn't it? We have a lot of blended learning happening now. So split between classroom and online, and seeking ways for that collaboration to work seamlessly is very important. So thank you for your comments. Let's think now about general English collaboration, so activities we get the students to do in our general English classes versus in the exam English class. And again, if you have any comments that you want to make or things that you want to add to my ideas on this slide, please put them in the question and answers, and Jenny will talk about them a bit later. And you can see here that I think that general English lends itself to collaborative tasks, to working together in teams, in groups, perhaps more effectively than exam English classes. So in a general English class, we may ask students to comment on a blog post, we may ask them to write a review in pairs or in groups, we may ask them to give a group presentation, perhaps visiting a new city, or create a poster, they may arrange a day out. They may then do the typical classroom activities, comparing answers to a question, perhaps a role play activity with their classmates. And what we're seeing here is that many of these collaborative activities that we have in a general English class are real world activities. They focus quite heavily on functional language, and what I mean by functional language is the language that we need for effective communication in different situations. So the function of complaining in a restaurant, the function of ordering something when you have a meal, the function of going shopping. These arguably increase motivation. If we look at the exam English environment, I think quite traditionally our collaborative tasks focus very much on exam-focused tasks. So it might be a discussion about the exam, it might be to compare answers to a question, and it might be giving peer-to-peer feedback. But these activities are very much focused within the classroom environment. And I think that there can be limited real world skills development. Well, there can be a lot of real world skills development, but sometimes. Jenny, do you have anything else to add based on the question and answers from our educators at this point?
Okay, just having a look at some of the comments people have said at this point. People say create a role play, seeing a museum, how to collaborate during this. Lots of questions actually. Yeah, how to collaborate is coming up a few times.
Absolutely, yes, and that's something
again.
we're going to talk about. Okay, thank you, Jenny. So I think we can see that functional language and collaboration do go hand in hand, and perhaps traditionally functional language is used more frequently in a general English class than an exam English class. And why do we collaborate? Why do we need to collaborate in exam classes? Well, we know that there's been a lot of research that talks about collaboration in terms of increasing motivation, achieving higher results, more actively, and get students more actively involved in the learning process. And also collaboration can develop critical thinking and productive skills. So the reasons to collaborate are fairly well known. Some of the barriers to effective collaboration are, these are my ideas. Please feel free to type some of your own experiences or ideas in the question and answer box. But for face-to-face collaboration and online collaboration, there are many which are similar. So we have cultural barriers. Perhaps collaboration is not something that typically takes place in the classroom in some cultures. We have the perceived value of collaboration. So do our students or even us as educators, do we see the value in collaborative tasks? Do we prefer, or do our students prefer, a much more teacher-centered environment? We have maybe personality conflicts. Some of our students may not get on very well with each other. Accessibility, lack of teacher planning and preparation was something that I discovered was quite problematic for me, particularly when I started doing more online teaching, which leads us into the obvious, of course, COVID-19 and how that has impacted face-to-face classroom activities and collaboration. Additionally, for online teaching, we have the problems with asynchronous tasks. So students may not be in the same place at the same time doing the same thing. We have then added issues with connectivity, internet problems, access to computers, access to mobile technology, and again, lack of teacher planning or preparation. So when we're thinking about accessibility, these were some of my ideas about what accessibility means. And when we say whether something is accessible, I'm thinking in quite a broad sense. So if I'm asking students to do something together, to work together, how accessible is that task for them? Do they have the right skills? Do they have the right access? So do they have access to smartphones, the right books, the applications? For example, when I was teaching my students in China, I wanted to use WhatsApp and I wanted to use Google, both of which the students were unable to access from their country. They could access WeChat, but some of my other students couldn't. So in terms of applications, I'm also thinking about what applications are accessible to different students from different countries you might have in one class. We have the environment. For example, they may only be able to do homework on the bus. Perhaps they can't do it at home for whatever reason. We then have language level and medical conditions, which can be seen, physical disabilities, or unseen, for example, anxiety. So one of the ways that we can think about making sure that our collaborative tasks, the tasks that we ask our students to complete, are accessible is by considering personas. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever created personas, but personas are basically fictional but realistic learners. And you might include a name. I would always give a persona a name because you're trying to make them real learners. You would include maybe their interests, their education, their employment, how available studying is for them. You may include their learner goals, so what they hope to achieve from their learning experience, their expectations, both of their learning, but also of you as a teacher, any obstacles that they might have to success, and their unique qualities. So when we're planning our lesson, or we know we're going to have a new class, personas, these fictional learners, can add value as they help us to think about how we can meet our learners' needs. So they help us to adapt our materials and activities as we need to. So you can see here that I've created 4 personas, and these are not real people. These are imaginary students, because I'm starting a new class in 2 weeks' time. I'm starting an exam class, and I know I will have students from different backgrounds and different countries, but I don't know the students individually. So in order to plan my lessons and to plan my lessons effectively, I'm creating these fictional learners. And you typically do this before you start your classes, so before you commence your classes. You can see I have created 4 personas: Minji, Ronaldo, Gracie, and Matteo. You'll see that I have made up in my mind. I've given them all ages, I've given them places to live, I've given them a learning focus, and I've also included something which could be a barrier to their learning, or a barrier in this instance to them being able to participate in collaborative activities. And I'll give you some time, a little time to read these, but you can see here Minji. She's a 16-year-old Chinese student studying in Beijing. She lives at home with her parents and travels every day to her school near her city centre. Her learning focuses on improving her English language skills so she can apply to a top university. But Minji has dyslexia and prefers not to let anyone know. We then have Ronaldo, an IT consultant living in Spain. He wants to relocate. He wants to prove his English language proficiency so he can apply for a promotion, but he doesn't intend to speak English once he has relocated. He's got some back pain because he's had a traffic accident 5 years ago, and he can't sit for longer than 10 minutes. Gracie, Polish 23-year-old nurse. You can see her learning focus is on her continued professional development. And Gracie gets a little bit anxious in groups and avoids speaking in unfamiliar situations. And finally, Matteo, who's 30, living in Brighton. Unfortunately, his qualifications as a teacher aren't recognised in the UK, and he wants to get his recognised qualifications. We can also see in my made-up character Matteo that he has hearing loss in his left ear and is a proficient lip reader. So we need to remember that all of our students have their own context, and a lot of this we cannot see. In the class, I can see Minji is 16 from China. I can see Ronaldo is Spanish. He may tell me his age. Gracie is a Polish 23-year-old nurse, and Matteo lives in Brighton. But a lot of what's below the surface, I cannot see. I do not know their learning focus, other than the fact they want to pass the exam. And it's really important that we consider these things when we're planning for our lessons. So let's look at an example of a collaborative activity. So we can see here that I've said to my students, sit in groups of 3, and 15 minutes writing a list of reading and use of English Part 6 exam tips. And then I want you to present your tips to the class. I've asked everybody to speak when they're presenting their tips, because for me as a teacher, as an educator, I want them to talk, I want them to communicate. But how accessible is this task for my fictional students, Minji, Ronaldo, Gracie, and Matteo, when we consider their persona? Just think about that for a moment. So, for example, we've got Ronaldo, who doesn't like to sit for longer than 10 minutes because he gets back pain. I wouldn't know that as an educator. So when I'm asking Ronaldo to sit for 15 minutes, that's actually going to cause him some discomfort. As we know, some students like to stand up, some students like to walk around while they're thinking. So by considering, by creating these personas, it might help me to rephrase this collaborative activity in a way that is accessible for all of my students. If you would like to add any comments to that, how I might change this task so that it would be more suitable for Minji, Ronaldo, Gracie, and Matteo, you could put your answers in the question and answer box. That would be super. So my task, my collaborative task, is sit in groups of 3, spend 15 minutes writing a list of reading and use of English Part 6 exam tips, then present your tips to the class. When presenting, everybody must speak, and these are my students, my fictional students that I have in this class. So what are the barriers for these students when I ask them to do this collaborative activity?
Okay, everyone. So if you've got any feedback for Deb, now's the time to put it in the question. Like, how might you adapt your activity for these different students? If you've got any ideas, put them in the questions now. Someone's saying, Maria Ralph is saying, walk around while discussing. Victoria Kobileva is saying, maybe assign some rules, ask them to stand out right on the board. There could be one speaker. Let's see, any other ideas? Okay, someone's saying it would be most enjoyable for Matteo as a teacher. That's actually not such a bad idea, because you can take turns, can't you, in getting people to teach each other. That is a good way of swapping things around and shaking them up in the classroom. Someone's Hussein Bashiri is saying creating personas is beautiful. Oh dear, I've just lost your comment. Sorry, it's moving along too quickly. Yeah, creating personas is beautiful based on what you've shared with us so far. It's an inclusive and collaborative process. So there you are, some nice feedback on the idea. Someone is saying divide among small groups, give them different responsibilities, different ideas. Mingle work might be better. List down the ideas to make it easier for the person who has the ear problem. Minji's dyslexia could be a difficulty. Maybe making the activity more oral rather than written would be a good idea. Someone's saying, Shubham Patil is saying, adding functional activity to develop students' brain function. Someone's saying, have them decide how they want to work. So yeah, there's lots of ideas. Think about 3 tips you want to share with your class. In this way, they don't necessarily have to sit for 15 minutes. Share the tasks into subtasks according to their abilities. Brainstorm ideas to the whole class. Split the group. Matteo could stand up while working. Anyway, yeah, there's lots of people suggesting standing up, walking around, different ways of moving the class. Someone, Sahar Amer is saying, I would give it beforehand, give them time to prepare and use the flipped classroom idea. Okay, lots of ideas there. I'm sure you've got plenty more. But Deb, we pass back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. That's really useful for me as well. I mean, I like this idea of asking students how they want to work, because, as I mentioned earlier, often with our students, as with ourselves, you know, there's things that we don't want to share. There's things that we don't want to talk about. That could be a barrier. When I was studying for my master's degree, you know, I felt quite intimidated that I was studying with people that had several degrees, doctorates, etc. And I thought that nobody would want to listen to what I had to say. And I found that was a barrier for me. It was a real barrier for me when I was working collaboratively with my other, with my peers, because I was anxious about it. I didn't think I knew as much as they did. And so I think we find that, you know, by thinking about personas, by creating personas, we can think about our non-typical student. And in fact, we are all non-typical, aren't we, to some extent. And it just helps us, I think, when we are creating these collaborative activities or any activities in the classroom, to be considering the things that we cannot see. Okay. So the point then, I think, is that we need to keep the real world in mind. And for me, in an exam class, we need to ensure that we are exploiting functional language opportunities. We looked earlier at our, when we were thinking about collaboration in the classroom, and we were thinking about functional language and how that supports collaboration. I think it's important where possible to bring that into the exam. So let's look at some ways that we did this in Open World. We can see here, this is an excerpt from Open World First, which is Bella. You can see there's some information there about Bella and a box of words: volunteering, on-the-job training, distance learning, traditional education and an apprenticeship. And so for me, it's about thinking how we can use our exam materials both for the exam and also how we can transfer those skills from the exam into the real world and in a collaborative way. So I'll just give you a second to. Okay, and there you can see on the left is the page from which it comes, which is a exam skill, is the Speaking Part 3 task, and then the collaborative activity and real world skills development that we can do alongside that is describing, introducing yourself. I think it lends itself quite well to that, because we're looking at about, Bella being passionate about learning. So that's something about Bella, that she's just graduated, that she's trying to get a job, where she's working at the moment, and that she spent 6 months in Africa. So from a functional language perspective, describing or introducing yourself to others would be quite a useful collaborative activity alongside the exam skill. And I think that our students may not realise that the exam skills have any real world value. Sometimes they don't. And I think it's important that we as educators make those connections very clear. If we're encouraging our students to make the jump between the exam class and the real world, then we should be encouraging them to make those links. And collaborative tasks, of course, are great for doing that. So here we have another. This again is from Open World First. This is Jake and Christy, and this is Christy's story in the course book. So I'll give you a moment to read that before we move on. You can see there that Christy's having some problems with her friends, particularly around cooking, and they need to talk. And then we have Jake's version of the same story. If I'll just give you a moment to read that. Okay, so we have clearly a breakdown in communication between two friends. And in the course book, we can see that the task here is, yes, in fact, Jake and Christy are friends. They've been having some problems. The students split into A and B and read one story each. But then they have to highlight issues or regrets which need to be discussed. So this is a way for them to practice wish, if only, and regret. So for example, I regret making new food with when the oil was rancid. I wish I had helped you clean the kitchen, that type of thing. Exam skills was part 4, sentence transformation, different ways of expressing regret. And we can see here that the collaborative activity, the real world activity, skills development, is dealing with difficult and awkward situations. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to link the exam task with the real world task, or the real world skill, should I say, using a collaborative. And this is taken from real world, the real world section of the course. Now you can use these types of, I'm sure you have these types of activities in whichever course books you use. This one here, working in pairs, so clearly a collaborative task, choosing a job advertisement, writing questions, the exam skill, writing a letter of application, and then the real world collaborative task is having a job interview or interviewing job candidates, if that was something that our student did in real life. This is taken from the A2 key, open world key, and here we have another life competency activity, which is a group work, sharing ideas and problem solving. So this is about information. If someone were to be ill in your city, where you can buy medicines. So lots of online research could take place if you have the use of mobile technology in your classrooms for remote learning. And then creating a leaflet for visitors. If your students are not face-to-face, they could create one of the online, something like an online mind map, or online document in Google Drive, something like that. And the exam skills there are the writing part 7, telling a story which is shown in pictures, which is there to question 11. And the collaborative tasks, the collaborative activities could be, this is not an infinitive list, but could be maybe giving directions to hospital or to the nearest doctor, communicating information at A2 level, and selecting important information. So selecting the most important information to tell somebody. If you were creating maybe the poster. So thinking now about, I touched on online collaborative tasks, moving now into online, or remote or online collaborative activities, activities outside of the classroom or an exam class. This is something that was created in mindomo.com. or mindomo.com, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, sorry. Here's my student Tom, he gave me permission to use that. But here we had in an exam class parts of speech, and we had all of the parts of speech, verb, nouns, adjectives, etc. And the task for the students was to go into this mind map on their own, in their own time over the weekend, and they had to create a sentence using the relevant parts of speech. So Tom, in this example, thought he'd be quite funny. He had to use this or these, and he said this exam is hard. You'll notice that I've gone in and replied to Tom, because I think it's part of thinking about student generated materials in a sort of a general sense. This allows me to think about what materials we need to cover in class, what we need to do in the classroom environment. And I think one of you mentioned the flipped classroom earlier, and this is an example of how you might do that. So I've asked Tom here, you can see what he thinks is the hardest part of the exam, and the response I went on to get from Tom helped shape what we focused on in the classroom. So this is how we can get our students to work together to create sentences using particular parts of speech, which was very important for their exam. But not only that, it allowed me in a slightly flipped way to then in class focus on specific things that the students wanted to do. You'll notice that Tom put his name in brackets, and I always ask the students to do that when we are working on something collaboratively like a mind map, because then other students can see, I can see who they are. Initially, I didn't ask my students to do that, and I wasn't sure who had who had left what comment. So that was quite problematic. So we got into the habit of asking their names in brackets, just to make sure that I knew who they were. So this here is, as you can see, Twitter. I don't know if any of you, I'd be interested actually if you could put in the question and answer whether you have actually used Twitter with your students as a collaborative tool. I haven't, but I am going to the next time I teach, because this is an example here of a teacher that has an English as a second language class, and she created the page, I guess, but it wasn't really a page. Her students all set up Twitter accounts, and she created, put questions on Twitter for the students to answer. Now, evidence suggests that students' motivation is increased when their work will be viewed by someone other than their teacher. So there is some evidence to suggest that students are much more careful with their work, they're much more reflective, and they think about what they're doing when they know that people are going to look at it, when they know that others will see their work. And you can see here that the teacher asked the students to tweet a metaphor, which was the classroom activity that they had, but this could be something exam related. You could ask the students to tweet their top 3 exam tips, for example, and not only then will they get comments from their class, they'll also get comments from everybody else on Twitter. So I am interested, Jenny, whether anybody has any thoughts about using Twitter as a tool, a collaborative tool in the classroom, or in fact whether anyone has already used Twitter successfully. If there's anything in the question and answer box, Jenny, I would be really pleased to hear it if you could let me know.
Okay, someone has mentioned that they use Facebook and it's group chat as opposed to Twitter. If anyone has used Twitter, it would be interested to hear from you, or if anyone's inspired by that idea. Lubna Amir says it looks interesting. So obviously a good idea. Thing about Twitter is it's very open, isn't it, Deb? You know, you can have conversations with anyone. It's very easy to just set up and join in. Okay, Tamara is saying I use a Russian social website, Vkontakte or vk.com. I think that's a bit like Facebook, I believe. Tatiana is saying, I'm afraid I haven't used Twitter yet. Some courses use it as a way of communicating. That's interesting. If you know which courses, it would be useful to see. I'm just trying to go back up the chat because it's moving very quickly again at the moment. Someone's saying yes, Twitter is good as synchronous communication. It's sort of very live and immediate, isn't it? You can do it in class, out of class. Someone says not exactly Twitter, but have used a web page that was designed for the purpose, so some other form of chat. It does look as if there are various kinds of chat platforms that people have used. Not yet used Twitter. Seems to be an interesting interactive tool. So, you know, it's the idea, it's out there. Someone's saying, I use TikTok. Yes, I know TikTok. Yeah, there are lots and lots of social platforms, so it's worth experimenting, I would say. See what you think would work for you and your students. Depends on the age of the students as well, of course, doesn't it?
It does, absolutely. Thank you, Jenny. It's interesting, Tatiana mentioned that she doesn't have a Twitter account, and I only set my Twitter account up when I started my master's degree because I had to collaborate using Twitter. That was one of the tasks I had to do, and I was petrified of it. I was absolutely petrified of it. But I realised that, you know, I asked a question and it was very responsive. It was very responsive. You know, I asked if I should join a group, and lots of people responded, and I became much less afraid. And so I think it's a real world. It's very real world, isn't it? There's lots of platforms being discussed. Obviously, make sure that your students can access whatever social media platform you decide to do. For example, as I mentioned earlier, if you have students who are accessing your lessons from China, for example, they may not be able to access Facebook. So do think about that, but it is something I think that's worth exploring. Okay, so tips for setting asynchronous collaborative tasks. I think I discovered when I was teaching online this year that it's very easy to mess up collaborative tasks when the students will be completing them at a different time, when they will be working independently. Students have no way of immediately clarifying instructions. They have no immediate access to you as the educator, so they can't check that they've understood the instruction. So it's imperative that you spend the time up front, and it can be time consuming, absolutely, it can be time consuming, but you need to really think about the instructions you're going to give the students and have a clear aim, show links to the classroom activities, and make sure they know when they need to finish the task by. I found it quite useful to number the steps and start with a verb, so that the students are really clear about what they need to do and why they're doing it, because you will not be there. I was not there when my Chinese students did their tasks. I was in bed asleep whilst they were up working. You need to really think about how you're going to moderate the student contribution. I think I found that the students can lose motivation very quickly if you are not stepping in and out to moderate the contribution and give them feedback. So here is an example of a forum that I set up. I've had to block the student names out because I don't have permission from them to use their names. So I've blocked them out so you can't see who they are. But you can see that there were 154 posts. You can use any platform for this. I used Minerva, which was the intranet site for the institution I was working for at the time. But you can use any of the wonderful platforms that you mentioned earlier. And here's an example. This was a very basic instruction here. Give 3 reasons why introductions and an outline is important for your presentation. This was something that we were working on. This could be specifically related to the exam, absolutely. give 3 reasons why body language is good when you're doing the speaking exam, for example. And here you could see that the students started to interact with each other, albeit in a rather basic way. So we have a student here giving 3 reasons, and another student practicing their language to agree, I can agree more. And then you will see that I then nip in and ask a follow-up question. So asking follow-up questions are really important. The students need to know you're there. The students need to know that you are supporting them. So you can't just set this up and then walk away. And as was mentioned earlier about the flipped classroom, this will allow you then to focus on what you need to focus on in the class, following what the students said in this asynchronous collaborative activity. And here you can see, again, students adding ideas and the responding, and students then starting to respond to each other. You can see that it is fairly basic in terms of the students collaborating with each other, talking to each other, but this was a set of students who it was not, they were not used to collaborating at all. So the fact that they responded in this way to each other was quite a step forward. Here you can see something that was a bit more, I guess here you can see that I've labelled the instructions clearly with numbers. This was a TED Talk, so I wanted the students to watch as a weekend task. I've colour coded the things that they need to do, and again been very clear. Reply to this message with 4 sentences that they know. And you can see that I've taken this opportunity to correct some language errors, but be focused on, I guess when giving feedback, what I'm saying is just focus on a specific thing, because otherwise the feedback just turns into something that's just too much for the students to get to grips with. Here you could say, you can see that I've just focused on one thing due to using ing rather than correct every error, because it can be very demotivational if you then go back and list 25 or 30 things that got incorrect. So finally then, here are some collaborative online tasks which were also student-generated materials. When we're thinking about student-generated materials, I guess what we're thinking about are 2 things. We're thinking about the value of creating the material. As we know, collaboration, there's evidence that collaboration is very motivational and supports learning, but also the act of creating something, using multimedia tools which encourage personalised creativity, is very motivational. It does deepen learning, and developing creative habits and confidence then will help our students to tackle real-world activities. The process of collaboration, of creation, sorry, also requires reflection. So the students, when they're creating something, particularly if it's online and other people will see it, they will have to reflect on what they're doing. So you can see that we've got some examples here: collaborative wiki to create an exam advice sheet for new students, YouTube videos to explain grammatical structure, a learning journal, blog or web. That's a good way to get to know your students, because they're talking about how they're feeling as they're as they're progressing through your course, creating a blog, that's a video blog. So for example, interviewing exam students. You can see there a list of tools that you might find useful. I took this from toolboxhyperisland.com. There's a few collaborative online tools that could be used there. And it would be great really to hear of other tools that you yourselves have used really. So that's about it from me. Jenny, over to you when you're ready. Thank you very much, everybody, for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Deb, for such an interesting session. Attendees, if you haven't seen it already, you can now download your attendance certificate from the handouts on the right of your screen. We'll also send it by email in the next few days or early next week. If you've got any questions for Deb, we don't have a huge amount of time. Start typing them in the question box now, and we'll try and answer at least a couple of those before the end of the session. Before we go, I just thought I'll tell you a little bit about Open World, which is the course that Deb is an author of or co-author. It's a brand new course, and the idea is that it genuinely takes you further. It explores real-world communication strategies while redefining exam preparation. Looks like my slide has just gone. Deb, I wonder if you could pop that back on for me.
In now. There we
go. Okay, just so that we can see the books. So there's a unique exam journey in every course which maximises students' performance, providing a systematic route to exam success. And there are also real-world sections which open up language knowledge with listenings, videos, and texts that introduce common yet surprising expressions. There are also mobile animations that spark learning before or after class with grammar on the move. So that's part of the kind of flipped classroom approach that we've touched upon in this webinar. Currently available, we've got Open World Key, Preliminary and First, and coming soon in December, we've got the brand new Open World Advanced. Okay, now let's see what questions we've got time for. Again, we are running out of time. It's been such a jam-packed webinar. So much great content there from you, Deb. I think, and I'm seeing lots of great comments as well from the audience, how much they've appreciated it. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time and for sharing this. Many, many thanks for the presentation. It's lovely to see all these comments. Does anybody have any questions? I know we picked some up earlier. I'm just going to have a look in the chat. One person asked earlier on in the webinar, how is peer-to-peer feedback organised? I don't know if you'd like to comment on that, Deb.
Sorry, Jenny, I lost you for a second. Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah, one of the questions was, how is peer-to-peer feedback organised? This was a question from earlier.
Right, okay, so peer-to-peer feedback might be something like, let's think about an exam speaking activity where you have maybe groups of 3, perhaps one student is the candidate for the exam, another is the examiner asking questions, and then you might have a third student listening specifically for target language and making notes as they listen. So they might be listening for, I don't know, let's imagine you're teaching second conditional structures. And then afterwards, the listening student would provide some feedback to the students. It might be how many times they used a particular piece of language, whether their intonation was correct, whether they were making eye contact. It could be anything that you've targeted that they feedback. If that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Deb, for that explanation. Someone's just saying, could you repeat the name of the last tool you were talking about in the presentation?
So
I guess
let's
a collaboration tool.
Let's just go back then. Again. It was Toolbox, Hyper Islands. There's quite a lot of useful collaborative tools in here. I've used some myself. It's quite a useful website. I don't know too much about it, but because I've only recently started using it. But there we go.
Okay, thank you, Deb, for clarifying that. And I'm afraid, everyone, that's all we've got time for. Thank you all for attending. Thank you all for all your positive feedback. We're glad that you've got so much out of it. There's lots of great ideas in there for everyone. As we've said, you can download your certificate quickly now, or we'll email you all after the webinar, and again with a recording, which will be by early next week. So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day and take care and keep safe.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Goodbye.